starting, and I will just say a very few words about you. So Professor Tiago Domingos is a professor in environment and energy at the University of Lisbon, and is also a researcher and the president of the Maritech Center. And his background is mostly in physical engineering and in environmental engineering, as he got a PhD in environmental engineering. So today, as you can already see, I will present us a talk entitled Understanding the Material Basis of Economies Through the Useful Exergy Approach. So again, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours, Professor.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to you, and for the nice introduction. So I'll dive into my talk. As I mentioned before, if you have any particular burning question as I go along, please feel free to interrupt, to raise it, and then the bigger stuff that you may have, we can leave it to the end. So my topic today is what's written here, understanding the material basis of economies through the useful exergy approach, which is an approach grounded in thermodynamics, but it's a particular approach coming from thermodynamics. Okay, and the context of what I'll be talking about is economic growth. So I'll just start with just starting from scratch, let's say, from the most basic mainstream growth model, the neoclassical growth model, where we have an aggregate production function that uses capital and labor to deliver GDP and then to deliver output. And then this output is divided between consumption and investment leads to increasing capital. Along my talk, I will frequently use examples from Portugal, which is the country where which is where I come from. It's the one I know better, and it's where the story I'm going to tell you about is now most coherent and complete. But as we go along, I will frequently, almost all the time, tell you what are the generalizations that we have already obtained for other countries. So you have here just a normal graph of GDP a long time for Portugal. Basically growth and then stagnation. And since in fact the graph you see here is linear, it effectively means that in terms of growth rates, you have high growth rates in the beginning, and then the growth rates are decreasing. And then in the last 20 years, there's basically a stagnant GDP. In any case, overall, nowadays, GDP is around 6 times, total GDP is around 6 times what it was in 1960. So as introduced by the previous slide, mainstream economics strives in the first place to describe GDP using the 2 production factors which are paid for by GDP, capital and labor. And as you all know, when you create a weighted average of capital and labor, roughly 1/3 for capital and 2/3 for labor, according to the cost shares in GDP, this weighted average grows much slower than GDP. And so, in fact, the 2 fundamental factors of production considered in mainstream economics are very, very far from explaining what's happening with GDP. And this gap, discovered by Robert Solow in the 50s, is called total factor productivity, which you see here on the right-hand side. Total factor productivity being the ratio between observed GDP and the evolution of this weighted average of stock and labor. And what you can observe in the case of total factor productivity is that it increased fast in the first 15 years of our story here. Then it kept on increasing, but slower in the 80s and 90s. And then from 1995 onwards, it has been basically stagnant. And this first fast increase of TFP and then progressive stagnation is in fact a common pattern to all developed economies. the ones that industrialized earlier than Portugal reached this stagnation earlier in the 70s. Portugal just didn't reach it in the 70s because it was a late industrializer, and so it's arrived there later. And where TFP comes from is a main puzzle in economic growth theory, and the stagnation of TFP is a major challenge in terms of economic policy, and it's all around the place in policy debates all around the developed world. And in fact, in the more advanced developed economies. I have behind me here, over here, this one of the most famous books which currently describes this, talks about this for the US, where you guys are, The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert Gordon. Exactly, looking at this. And by the way, curiously enough, bringing up some hints, which in a sense lead into my story, but which are just like grasping at the story, because in fact, Robert Gordon comes to this just with economic knowledge. He does know a lot about technology, and that's why I think as an economic historian, he manages to go much further than other economic historians, but he is very, very far from the story which I will tell you today. But the story I will tell you today, in fact, fully explains these attempts that Robert Gordon makes at trying to explain the stagnation in mostly American economic growth, but basically what he talks about is applicable to other developed countries. Grégoire, your hand is raised.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me well enough?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to ask to be sure. So you say you have a weighted average of capital and labor. Are the weight factors constant, or like basically what is the form of the production function that you assume behind it?
So this isn't assume a production this assumes a production function exists, but it doesn't have to assume any particular production function. This is the usual growth accounting exercise. And the weights are variable a long time. Every year, the weights are the cost shares of capital and labor in GDP. And so a long time, these cost shares change.
Okay.
The assumption for doing this is the standard neoclassical assumption that production factors are paid at their marginal productivity. But I will leave it for later if you guys are interested in. In fact, the story I'm telling you here can be retold in a way which is not dependent on the cost share assumptions, but I'll leave that for later, because today and now I will be telling it with the cost share assumptions.
Okay, because basically if you take the cost share assumption, it means that you have a Cobb Douglas, and even though what is it?
But it works actually with everything. You know, it's an
Yep.
account.
Yeah. Okay.
It always works, Grégoire, because it's instantaneously. It applies to homogeneous first degree production function, but it can change from instant to instant. In fact, there's no underlying assumption of a production function. The only required underlying assumption is that first degree homogeneity of a production function, which could be in fact different for every year, and the assumption that production factors are paid at marginal productivity. That is the one central, these two assumptions: first degree homogeneity and that production factors are paid their marginal productivity. But that's it. You don't need any more restrictive things than that. And so the weights can change a long time. And that's what you see here. Okay, so, this puzzle has been addressed, I would say, unsuccessful, only with limited success in mainstream economics ever since it was discovered in the 1950s. That's the puzzle that's expressed here. Here you see the particular case of having a Cobb-Douglas production function, but you could have any other production function. There I have it, in fact, here just as as a context to then start telling the ecological economic story based on thermodynamics of trying to address this puzzle. And this ecological economic story starts with people originating from physics, Rainer Kummel, Bob Ayres, and Benjamin Ward coming from environmental science. And it's basically, in a simplistic schematic way, it's about adding an extra production factor, which is energy, and trying to see if adding this third production factor explains the total factor productivity puzzle. Basically, what you have here, so in the Ayres-Kummel-Ward approach, energy is introduced as a production factor, namely useful exergy, but in a moment, I'll explain to you what useful exergy exactly is. So for now, just think we're talking about energy. And they do it either in the Cobb-Douglas formulation, where you add to capital and labor an extra production factor, which is energy. They retain constant returns to scale, as you see here, because you have K raised to alpha, labor L raised to beta, and energy raised to 1 minus alpha minus beta. And so necessarily, in their approach, the cost share theorem cannot be obeyed. Both in their semi-standard approach of using Cobb-Douglas and then in this Line-X aggregate production function that was developed by Rainer Kummel, which is also a production function, which is a function of energy, labor, and capital, but with this small sophisticated form you see here, which has some underlying assumptions. Now, in their clearly pioneering approach, the introduction of energy was capable of explaining total factor productivity. So that was a major achievement of this group of people. But we have clearly to see it as a first step and not as the definitive story, because there are several limitations in their approach. Some of them are only limitations if you come from a neoclassical point of view. But others are limitations, I would say, are limitations, whatever the point of view you bring to the problem. First one is clearly only a limitation if you come from a neoclassical point of view. Cost shares in their approach are very far from the estimated parameters. So energy would normally have an almost negligible cost share and they get a very high cost share. And then typically in their approach, labor, instead of having a cost share of 2/3, has a much lower implied cost share. So this is the first point. Now, the second one is, I think, much more important because it's an inconsistency associated to the national accounts approach. So it's an inconsistency which is, I would say, whatever the perspective you bring to the problem, doesn't have to be neoclassical, can be any of the heterodox schools. I would say, but later I would be happy if you disagree with me, but I would say that it is an inconsistency that let's say any economist would agree. And the problem is their big success was using useful exergy. And let me now add one thing which is important about useful exergy. In a moment, I'll explain in more detail useful exergy. But the important thing about useful exergy is that it is at the useful stage and not at the primary stage. So it is not coal under the ground. It is not electricity coming out of a power plant. It's the light coming out of a lamp, or the mechanical work coming out of an engine, or the cold air coming out of an air conditioner. And the point is that this energy flow is obviously not a primary factor of production, because to be able to deliver the cold air, the mechanical work, the light, you need machines, capital has been used, labor has been used, and so useful exergy is not a primary factor of production. And so whenever you introduce energy in these equations, whenever you introduce energy in the aggregate production function, but in a form which is at the useful stage, you are doing something inconsistent, because you are putting energy at the useful stage as if it was a primary factor of production. Third point, can let me just stress in the second point. It is only when Ayres, Kumel, and Waugh used energy at the useful stage that they were successful in explaining total factor productivity. So if you use energy at the primary stage, so theoretically coal under the ground, are not capable of explaining total factor productivity. Third point is that they're mostly successful when using the Linex production function, the second one we have here, which is non-standard. This in itself is not a problem. So again, it's just a problem if you're coming from neoclassical point of view. Their econometric methods are not at all state of the art. Again, this is not a problem if you think standard econometric methods are okay. In fact, I think there are good statistical reasons to think that the econometric methods they used are in fact not adequate. And then the last 2 points are that they considered labor just in terms of hours worked. They did not consider a human capital correction. So they have no way of distinguishing higher productivity from more skilled labor. And they consider capital stock, where basically you sum 1 million euros in machines with 1 million euros in buildings, as if they are providing the same service. And in fact, a 1 million euro machine, which is only going to last 10 years, necessarily provides a much higher value capital service per year than a 1 million euro building. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is what we've been working on in our research group in Lisbon, in collaboration with Bob Ayres and Benjamin Waugh themselves, and in collaboration with other people in the Exergy economics group. And basically, I will tell you about how we've been tackling these issues along 4 approaches. So we will look at the connection between useful exergy and the creation of economic value. So the direct connection between useful exergy and GDP. We will explore a way of considering useful exergy which allows us to not inconsistently treat it as a primary factor of production. We will look at as useful exergy as the correct measure of the delivery of capital services. We will look at the connection between aggregate exergy efficiency and technological progress, meaning total factor productivity. In a moment, I'll explain to you what aggregate exergy efficiency means. And finally, the last approach is to divide the economy in 2 components, where the first component is what we call an extended energy sector. And this extended energy sector delivers useful exergy as an intermediate factor of production. And so by definition, we are treating useful exergy consistently as what it is, an intermediate factor of production, primary factor of production. Okay, so I've been talking about exergy and useful exergy. Let's just have a quick view of what we're talking about here. So first, what does exergy mean? So the X over there in exergy is not a typo, it's there on purpose, and let me explain to you what it means. Now, let me start here by telling you the shocking statement that to say that a lamp consumes energy is wrong. And a lamp necessarily cannot consume energy because the first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy is conserved. So a lamp cannot consume energy. But a lamp is in fact doing something. And what a lamp is doing is that it uses electricity to convert it as much as possible into light, but also partially into heat. And the energy in the outcoming light and heat is equal to the incoming energy in the electricity, but it has lower quality. This is what the lamp does. It degrades energy. And we express this by saying that the incoming electricity has a higher exergy than heat and light, meaning that if you want to give a correct statement, the correct statement would be a lamp consumes exergy. If you want to think of where the word exergy comes from, say it like this. The incoming electricity has a higher capacity to exert an effect on its surroundings than the outcoming heat and light. Technically, in physics, we say the electricity has a higher capacity to perform physical work than heat and light. So that's exergy. But it's not just that we have to consider exergy in our analysis. We have to consider exergy at the useful stage, as I've been mentioning. And so we have to define these three stages in the conversion of energy in economies. The primary stage, where our energy resource is under the ground and no, in the economic sense of the term, no value has been added to it. So there has been no intervention of capital and labor. So it's coal there hidden in the ground. You can't even know that it exists, because to know it exists, geologists will have been working. So that's already a known coal, an area where you could exploit for coal already has a little amount of value added. So then the mine is built, the coal is extracted, it's transported, and for example, it's transported to a power station where it's converted into electricity. And this electricity coming out of the power station is what we call the final stage. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that in any transformation, energy is degraded and exergy is destroyed. And that's what you see here. Of all the exergy that we had in the coal, only 40% will come out as electricity, 30% will come out as heat, because the heat that comes out of a power station can still be used for something. I don't know if this is the case in Washington, but in many places, the heat coming out of power stations is used for district heating, so it can still be used for something. But part of the exergy is destroyed, and that's the shadow you see there, the dashed arrow. In this process, 30% of the exergy is destroyed. And this is a consequence of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, the final stage, we define it as the last stage where money is exchanged for energy. And that's why it has been always the stage, together with the primary one, that's been considered by energy economists and by energy analysts. It's convenient because it's there, it's available in the accounts of companies and in national statistics. But in fact, electricity, we don't use electricity for anything. What we do is we transform electricity into other things. For example, in a light bulb, we transform electricity into light. And again, we have losses. Now, this light is at the useful stage. This is the moment where energy is finally used to create economic value. That's why I want a lamp. I want it to produce light so that I can see something, so that I can see a book. You guys there have your lights on, I think, so the light is allowing me to see you guys. And a very important point to understand is it is at the useful stage that we create economic value, and after the useful stage we are beyond the realm of thermodynamics. And that's because after the light is used to illuminate something, it's going basically to be scattered around the room, it's going to be absorbed by the walls, and it's going to be completely degraded into heat. And then what is left is information, which is then beyond thermodynamics. So this conceptually, I'm trying to persuade you that the useful stage is the right one to understand the link between energy flows and economics. And basically, this was already the insight of Bob Ayers, Rainer Kummel, and Benjamin Waugh in the work they did before that I've shown you. Okay, so now let's start looking at our four approaches, and let's start connecting useful exergy with the creation of economic value. So in the first approach, what I do is just to divide the final exergy and the useful exergy flows by GDP. That's the usual energy intensity. And what you see here are graphs on the left hand, they're both for Portugal. On the left-hand side, you have these ratios along 150 years. And on the right-hand side, you have a zoom in for the last 50 years. And what I think is remarkable that you see in these graphs is that at the final stage, you see that for long stretches of periods, the intensity is decreasing, meaning that you need less and less energy per unit of economic value. And this is what leads to all this optimistic views coming from economists. Academic economists, by the way, you don't see these optimistic views coming, let's say, from business people, but you see them coming from economists. The optimistic view that the amount of energy you need per unit of economic value will keep on going down, and this will help a lot in the energy transition required because of reaching net zero by 2050. But then if you look at the red line below, where I'm dividing the useful exergy which is the sum of the light coming out of the lamp for a whole economy, the light coming out of the lamps, the mechanical work coming out of the engines, the cold air coming out of the air conditions. I sum all of that, I divide it by GDP, and I find this remarkable result, which is along 150 years of economic history, where we start with an agricultural economy, somewhere along the way we have an industrial economy, then we have a services economy, and along this whole period, the amount of useful exergy required per unit of economic value is constant. This is surprising, but it underpins what I was trying to persuade you here, that the useful stage is the right stage to connect energy with the creation of economic value. And this is a first vindication of that fact. It's at the right stage because, in fact, we're always using the same amount of useful exergy to create economic value. And then if you want to understand why the red line is constant, but the final exergy intensity is coming down, that means that the final exergy intensity is coming down because we are becoming more efficient at converting final into useful exergy. Meaning all the engines, all the air conditioners, all the light bulbs in our economies are becoming more efficient at transforming electricity into light, gasoline into mechanical work. It is increasing thermodynamic efficiency. In a sense, and I don't know if most of you there in the audience are economists, or for those of you who are economists and also like people from management, our economies have not become more efficient at creating economic value out of energy. What they have become more efficient is at converting energy into energy. So the progress you see here is an engineering progress of transforming energy into energy, not of transforming energy into economic value. Now, the spaghetti you see here is the same graphs,
Tiago?
but...
Tiago?
Yeah.
We have two questions.
Yeah, no,
Ah.
yeah.
So I know I have.
Oh, you guys...
I can add something quickly.
That's right.
You'll do it too.
Sorry, guys, let me just tell you, I think it was only Grégoire that was raising his hand because, yeah, I don't see the hands. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've removed the hand. I just wanted to remark that, so does that mean that real GDP is actually a good measure seen from a physical point of view, since it correlates?
Yeah, that's one of the striking issues because, and I'll just give a short answer now, Grégoire, and then if you guys wanted, we can dive deeper into this at the end. Because naturally, we know of all these criticisms of GDP. Well, we know of all the limitations of GDP. I would say what's interesting to notice is that GDP, with all those reasons we could have for saying that GDP is a bad measure of economic activity, if in the end we find that it is proportional to something which is extremely objectively measured, which is an energy flow, that would mean that in spite of all those conceptual limitations that GDP has, maybe they are not so dramatic. So this is what I would say at this stage, and then I'd come back to it if you guys want to discuss this deeper, more deeply later. And there was a second question, right?
Yeah, Tiago, I have a question also for you, which is related to Grégoire's question. You didn't have any housing bubble in Lisbon in the past 20 years?
Yes, we did, Gael, but if I understand what would be the implication of your question, yeah. Notice that the GDP numbers we're using here for the ratios, for the intensity, are real GDP numbers. And so in fact, housing bubbles disappear because they are removed when you do the price index correction regarding houses.
Yeah, okay, in principle, yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, the point is a bit like my answer to Grégoire.
Yeah.
We would think, oh, okay, these corrections are not so good. In the end, they're not so bad because they allow us to do this. Notice in a very few slides, you'll see an example, a contrasting example of national accounting numbers, which our physical perspective shows to be very limited, curiously enough. But I wouldn't say the GDP numbers coming out of the national accounts for now are looking nice. Okay. So here I have this spaghetti, which is for the EU 15 countries along 50 years. It's the curves of useful exergy intensity. With the exception of Luxembourg, you can see that most of the countries have roughly constant lines a long time, but they are not as constant as Portugal. And what we did in a paper, which is in fact the paper you see there first on the left-hand side, the Sereno et al. 2014 paper, what we found is that these lines in fact are not as simply constant as for Portugal. These intensities are, however, constant if you control for two factors, which is two factors in terms of useful exergy, which is high temperature heat, which is something I haven't talked yet about, but which is one of the categories that we consider. So heat flows at very high temperatures, 1000 degrees Celsius. So we're talking about the heat flows that occur in things like aluminium factories, steel factories, cement factories, brick factories. Now, what's extremely interesting about this, and I think that the fact that we have control for this gives me confidence in what we're doing, because I think you may have already remarked that every case that I've mentioned of high temperature heat is associated to building investment goods. So investment goods, in a sense, are clearly thermodynamically working in a different way. The thermodynamic reason for that, by the way, is a simple thermodynamic reason is investment goods have to last and they have to be robust. As I said, glass also, cement, steel, all of that. And basically the thermodynamic way in which you make a material that lasts is that you go over a potential barrier. It's like there was a stable state for that material, and you heat it up a lot and you bring it to another steady state, for example, steel or ceramic or glass. And because you had to go up to a very high temperature and then down to, again, but to a different state, it's very hard to bring the material back to the original state. So that's why materials are durable. So you can see a very strong thermodynamic reason why high temperature heat is so closely connected to making metal goods. Now, you could ask, but why wasn't this relevant in Portugal? Because the curious, in fact, not so happy thing regarding Portugal, but the curious thing about Portugal is that our industrialization process was done a lot by importing the investment goods, namely from Germany. And so the manufacturing of investment goods with high temperature heat is not very relevant for the Portuguese economy. For other economies here, like Germany, UK, etc., well, Germany not so much, but for example, UK or even US, what has happened is that along the last 50 years, as they have de-industrialized, they are manufacturing less, they have less heavy industry. And so, that's why, say, look, for example, at the yellow line there for the US, you see it coming down, and it's basically coming down because there's less and less heavy industry. But once we remove the effect of heavy industry, we recover constant lines, as you have here, the red lines. Okay, let me move to our second approach, which is about how we can use, well, and let me just stress something. There's nothing, this is conceptually unimpeachable what I'm doing here. I'm dividing useful exergy by GDP. These are numbers that are meaningful regardless of the fact that useful exergy is an intermediate good. In fact, not absolutely consistent, but again, we can come back to this later, but almost absolutely consistent. Now, let me go, as I said, into my second approach, where I come back to the graphs that I had already shown with capital stock, labor, and total factory productivity. And now let me tell you a little bit more of what economics, mainstream economics, did since the time of Robert Solow. And it was to use quantities that I've already mentioned, which is the yellow lines you have here. And basically the yellow lines are the state of the art of what mainstream economics can do to explain, only partially, total factor productivity. So you go from capital stock to capital services. So you take into account, as I said, that a 1 million euro machine delivers more capital services than a 1 million euro building. and that's the correction to go from capital stock to capital services. And instead of accounting for labor just purely in terms of hours worked, you correct these hours worked for skill level, where skill is proxied by education. And you get this quantity, which is HL, which is human capital corrected labor. And now the yellow line grows faster than the blue line because along the industrialization processes of any country, including Portugal, a significant component of the industrialization process is that the investment mix shifts from being dominated by building and infrastructure to having a lot more investment in machines, and then later into information and communication technology. And you're shifting from long-lived capital items to short-lived capital items, which deliver more services per euro invested. They deliver those services during less time, but more services. And so as this shift happens, and when this shift is happening, services grow faster than stock. Also in Portugal, like in other countries, human capital has been growing, so the level of schooling has been growing, and so HL has been growing faster than L, and so overall, the yellow line grows faster. Let's see what this means in terms of total factor productivity. And now we go to the yellow line, which is in fact, the story becomes a story very close to, say, Robert Gordon's concerns about the American economy. What you see here is that once you take into account that part of economic growth is because you shift from buildings to machines, and a significant part of economic growth is because you shift from less skilled labor to more skilled labor, once you correct for that and you get the yellow line, what you see is that total factor productivity, in fact, only increased until the mid-1970s. And from then on, the yellow line is stagnant, no increase in total factor productivity, okay? And looking at the left-hand side, what you see is that there's still a big gap between the yellow and the black line. So there's still a lot of unexplained economic growth. And so what do we do in our second approach? What we do is, and there's a whole big, long econometric story that I'm not going to, I don't have time here to explain, but what we do is we find an econometric way of expressing the services of capital, not in terms of money, but in terms of useful exergy. Basically, we reinterpret that what essentially productive capital is the machines, and what machines are doing is deliver useful exergy. That's what you use a machine for. Think about any machine, and what they are always doing is they are converting energy and delivering a useful exergy flow. And then the dramatic thing you see here, which is now this green line where we're still using human capital corrected labor, but now capital is no longer measured in monetary terms as economists do, but capital is now measured in terms of the useful exergy it delivers. And what you see is that the green line is now basically overlapping the black line. So total factor productivity is completely explained in the sense that we no longer need it. If you look at the right-hand graph, you see that total factor productivity is constant along one. So what we're showing here is by looking at capital as and machines as a way of delivering useful exergy, we are capable of fully capturing the contribution of capital to economic growth in a way that monetary valuation is incapable of. And when we do that, we're so successful that we don't need anything else. Capital, measured as delivering useful exergy, captures everything. Now, to explain this a little bit better, I've come up with what I call this parable of the English farmer. And so this is parable in the biblical sense of the word. And sorry, Gael, if I make some mistake in my terminology here, please correct me. But so I'm trying to just like in a Bible story, I'm just capturing the essence, and so the details might not be exactly right, but I think this captures the essence. So think about this farmer, and think this is an English farmer in 1600, 400 years ago in England. This is a photograph, so it's not a photograph of an English farmer 400 years ago, but imagine it was. Now, 400 years ago, farmers in England worked the land with one horse. That's what you see here. And working the land with one horse or a mule or an ox is not very efficient. It's not very productive. And we know that it's not very productive because 400 years ago, almost all the English were farmers. Each farmer, not being very productive, could only produce enough food for his family, so everyone had to be a farmer, almost. Now, fast forward to the present, and the English farmer will now be working the land with a 100 horsepower tractor. What this literally means is that this tractor delivers 100 times more useful exergy than the horse. That's why we say it's a 100 horsepower engine. It's because it has the power of 100 horses. So the farmer is now controlling 100 times more useful exergy. He is 100 times more productive. And what's the proof of that? It's because now only 1% of the English are farmers. So one farmer is producing enough food for 100 farmers. This is, remember, this is a parable. There's a simplification here because, of course, England now imports more food than it imported 400 years ago. So this is not exactly a 1:100 ratio, but it is a very high ratio. Now, second half of the parable, using energy, I'm fully capable of explaining why the tractor is 100 times more productive than the horse. Now let's take an economic approach. In an economic approach, and that's in fact the way the whole growth accounting thing is done, and that's the way all of economics here is done, factors are paid their marginal productivity. What you have here is two different capital items, a tractor and a horse. Nowadays, a tractor will cost 30,000 euros, more or less, a 100 horsepower tractor. A horse will cost more or less 3,000 euros. So seen from the economic point of view, if the tractor is 10 times more expensive, that's because it's 10 times more productive. But physically, we know, objectively, much, much more objectively than an economic measure, that the tractor is 100 times more productive. And so with our physical measure, we are fully capable of capturing the productive capacity of machines in a way that economic measures aren't or haven't been up to now. And coming back to the graph, this explains what you see here. In the yellow line, we are capturing the delivery of services by capital using monetary measures, and we fail to capture the full value. In the green line, we are capturing the services of capital based on a physical measure of what they are delivering in terms of useful exergy, and we are fully capable of capturing the output. And so we have our second evidence for the extremely strong explanatory power of useful exergy in terms of understanding economic growth. And I now stress that, again, the approach I have here has no inconsistency with the fact that useful exergy is an intermediate factor of production, because in the analysis you see in this slide, I'm not considering useful exergy as a production factor in itself. I'm just saying that useful exergy is the best measure we have of the delivery of services by capital. So the production factor is still capital. We're just using useful exergy to measure it better. Okay, let's go into the third approach. In the third approach, we focus on our total factor productivity line. And now we look at final to useful exergy efficiency. Let me just flip back here on the slides, just to tell you what I'm talking about. All the machines that convert final into useful have an efficiency. An electrical motor has an efficiency of 90%. The gasoline motor in a car has an efficiency at most of 30%. An air conditioner may have an efficiency of 20%. These efficiencies are measured using useful exergy. We divide useful exergy by final exergy. For example, the lamp you see here has an efficiency of 20% because the useful exergy coming out is 20% of the final exergy going in. Now, one of the very interesting features of using exergy, and a unique feature of using exergy, is that exergy provides us with the only universal way of comparing all machines. Because with exergy, I can meaningfully compare the efficiency of an electrical motor, an internal combustion engine, a lamp, an air conditioner, a heat pump. I can put them all on the same footing. I can compare all of them. And in fact, I can construct the average of all of them. I can conceptually average all those efficiencies, obtaining an aggregate efficiency. In practice, what I do is that for a given economy, I divide the total useful energy exergy flow by the total final exergy flow, and I have an aggregate efficiency. Let me stress something. Many of you guys have been looking at energy policies, namely because of the energy transition and climate commitments. You hear all the time about targets. I know we have them in the European Union, targets for increasing energy efficiency. When those policies talk about energy efficiency, it's a misnomer because they are always talking about energy divided by GDP. They're talking about an intensity because they are not using the only way you have of having a true energy efficiency, which is when you divide energy by energy, namely useful divided by final. Now, we do that. That's a kind of routine thing that we do in our approach. And what you see here is on the right-hand side, you have this aggregate efficiency of all the machines in Portugal. And what you see is that this efficiency increased a lot from 1960 to 1970, then slower to 1980, then stagnated. And if you look at the left-hand side, you see that it roughly matches. And then we apply co-integration analysis to do this in a fully standard econometric way, and we find that there is co-integration between aggregate exergy efficiency, aggregate thermodynamic efficiency, and total factor productivity. And the match, as you see here, is extremely close. And on the left-hand side, you just see it for TFP, and then you see the implication of this for GDP. Grégoire, by the way, here we are using a Cobb-Douglas function with fixed coefficients for the brown line. So this is different from the graph in the beginning. But so in our third approach, what we show is that total factor productivity, which is something which economists have namely one famous one called Abramovitz in the 50s, and he's been still cited frequently today, said that total factor productivity is just a measure of our ignorance. Economists don't have any way of independently measuring total factor productivity. So you might even argue that the fact that economists are using total factor productivity is really not something scientifically sound. It only becomes scientifically sound if you have an independent theoretical framework which allows you to independently estimate something that conceptually makes sense as a measure of technological progress, which is a synonym of total factor productivity, and then you test what it does. And that's exactly what you have here. We have a physically constructed, completely non-economic way, completely physically based way of measuring technological progress as the average efficiency of all the machines in an economy, and lo and behold, it fully captures all of total factor productivity growth. Again, we are using a thermodynamic approach which has no inconsistency with anything in economic theory. We're just saying that the independently measured engineering efficiency of machines is an extremely close measure of what economists call technological progress or total factor productivity. Now, this also, we have the rigorous analysis done for Portugal, that's you have the reference down there in the slides. In fact, along the slide, you have the references for this, but then later I can send the presentation. We haven't yet done this same analysis rigorously for other countries, but here you get an inkling that it's also closely true for other countries. And now let me go into our fourth approach, which is its complete description would require more time than I have. But essentially, the concept is what I mentioned before, which is we divide the economy in two sectors. This is an unusual division because our two sectors each of these sectors is not the aggregate of what people would conventionally, of the conventionally considered economic sectors. Why? Our energy sector is what we call an extended energy sector, and it covers all the transformations in an economy from primary to final and then final to useful. The non-energy sector does everything else in the economy. So basically, there's a little bit of labor in the energy sector because of people being used as machines for their muscle work, which is something which is irrelevant nowadays, but it was important 50 or 100 years ago. And so the basic production factor in the energy sector is machines, the KE you see over there. The non-energy sector is where labor is used together with the passive components of capital, the buildings, the roads, everything else. So a conventional economic sector, say textiles, becomes split in this approach because a textile factory, the machines, the thermodynamic devices are in the extended energy sector, but everything else in the factory is in the non-energy sector. This has been taking us quite a few years to be able to recast the national accounts in a way that fits this, but we've done that. We're almost ready to submit the paper for that, because we've basically done a full national accounting consistent approach, but where the economy is divided in these two, in this way, which is not completely non-conventional. And then one of the things that comes out of this is that we're capable of extracting the price of useful exergy, which is a completely new measure, because up to now, you only have prices of primary energy and of final energy. No one up to now has been able to calculate the price at the useful stage. So the price of light, the price of mechanical work, the price of hot air in the good sense of the word, used to warm up buildings. And namely, and the person to mention here is the work of Roger Fouquet, which some of you may know, and he has calculations of energy services, but they are not complete in the sense that I'm going to mention. Because with the calculation here, we have an aggregate measure of the price of all the useful exergy used in an economy. That's the first characteristic. And the second characteristic is that, let's go back to the example of the lamp. The price of useful exergy we're calculating is the price of the light, but the unique feature we're capable of doing at the aggregate level is that the price of the light not only considers the price of the electricity going into the lamp, but also the cost of the lamp. So this is the true cost of the light coming out, because it has both the cost of the electricity and the cost of the lamp. Of course, to do it just for lamps is easy. The challenge that we had to face here is to do it for all the useful exergy flows that exist in an economy. Now, what happens is that strikingly, and this is something that I can Tatul go into the full story, but what again we see strikingly is that whenever total factor productivity is only going up, when the price of useful exergy is coming down, when we are no longer innovating in such a way that useful exergy becomes cheaper, total factor productivity no longer increases, and so the cheapest way of getting economic growth disappears. I'm going to skip over this, then if later you're interested, I can come back to these slides to look at this into detail. And so summarizing what we've been capable of doing in the last 10 years is we found these four main conclusions, which is that across countries and time periods, there is a lower bound or even a constancy to useful exergy intensity. There is a minimum amount of energy that's required to deliver economic value. So we cannot go to zero, which is obviously, this has been for long an intuition of ecological economics, but it has never been carefully formalized in a way which is theoretically sound and covers in an empirically correct way all of economic activities. When the services of capital are measured considering the useful exergy delivered by machines, we are capable of explaining total factor productivity, my parable of the English farmer. We have found that aggregate exergy efficiency, the aggregate efficiency of all the machines in the economy, is an almost 100% precise measure of what economists call technical progress, and that useful exergy price is closely related to total factor productivity. And so we've been able to do this in a way that never makes the mistake of considering useful exergy as the primary factor of production. All the approaches I've shown you here always respect the fact that useful exergy is an intermediate factor of production. And with this, we've been able to, I think, obtain a fully consistent picture of the relation between energy and economic growth. With the added value, now you may give more or less value to this, but that we're using standard aggregate production functions, standard labor and capital variables. So let's say in the spirit of communication between ecological economics and heterodox economics and mainstream economics, the story we're telling is not only completely physically grounded and physically consistent, but it is also fully, its narrative ties in fully with the mainstream narrative. I mean, fully, with the exception of everything which is different, which is in fact looking at the economy from a thermodynamic point of view. And so, and with what is our story, that useful exergy is closely tied to the creation of economic value. And so decreasing useful exergy price drives economic growth. And the interesting thing, which I didn't mention in the previous slide, is that useful exergy price is an aggregate variable that captures simultaneously the effects of increasing efficiency. So if my lamp becomes more efficient at converting final into useful, that effectively makes light cheaper. But light also becomes cheaper if I'm using cheap oil 50 years ago, because that makes the electricity cheaper and so the light cheaper. And extremely important, if lamps become cheaper, that also makes light cheaper. So useful exergy price is a variable that is integrative of all these things, which separately people have come up with, even mainstream economists. So even mainstream economists, especially like now, where there's Ukraine and the energy crisis, they will recognize that the price of primary energy is relevant. A very small minority of mainstream economists will talk about the extremely important role of decreasing real cost of capital of machines as a driver of economic growth. We also integrate that into the useful exergy price. And then something which is characteristic, that's what's just characteristic of our approach, is this capacity we have of measuring the aggregate efficiency of all the machines in the economy. So basically, in a single story, integrating plausible strands that have come up from economic history and growth accounting analysis, together with things that are characteristic of our thermodynamic approach, and they'll match and fit into a single story. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. So we usually go first for the online questions. Is there any question from Hugo or from Maria? No? Okay, so then we can go for the questions inside the room. I don't know. Does anyone have questions? I guess. Hugo?
There's some that are just spending more time on things that you explain to understand them deeper. So don't mind answering this question. I will just say everything that I've noted. But because it went fast, I didn't understand how H was measured. What's supposed to help to distinguish total factor productivity from labor saving tech progress, because that's the issue with Cobdoodlas in general. You cannot separate both, right? Well, instead, if you've measured this H through a different method previously and you reject it.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just jump into that one. So yeah, this is a bottom-up measure, which is it's fully neoclassical in it's bottom-up, but it's fully neoclassical in the following sense. You look at you compare workers with different education levels, and you compare their salaries. and assuming that's where this is 100% neoclassical, assuming that salaries are reflective of productivity, okay, then you assume that there's a productivity effect of skills which is captured by the ratio between salaries, and that's the correction factor that then you use to go from pure hours worked to skill or education corrected hours worked. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So it's purely empirical. It's not like other approaches where when you use a constant elasticity of substitution production function where you can tease out separate technological progress functions for each of them, which I would call it a top-down approach. It's not, it's a bottom-up. And notice, by the way, it's much better because one of these very, very big problems of these top-down approaches is that they assume that those technology augmentations, they have to assume that they go at us in a certain way, that they either grow exponentially, so they have to pre-impose how they are growing. The advantage with these approaches is that you're using empirical data for this. In a sense, it's analog to the advantage, which is ours, that we measure efficiency by an engineering thing that I can see in machines, instead of just assuming that it's growing exponentially and fitting some curve to it, which, by the way, notice, and sorry, Grégoire, I always do this, please don't mind, which is I always use the questions to talk about things that I didn't have time before. So what I was going to say, yeah, and then also something that happens is that I tell a joke and then I forget what I was going to say. But I was going to say about total factor productivity. Sorry, I forgot. I'll come back to this. Yes, keep going.
Come back, I'm sure. I have 5 more questions. I will try to say them fast so that you choose which one you can answer. Just wanted to make sure how useful Exergy could correlate with real GDP. It's not, so it's really linked with the light emitted with a lamp, even if the lamp is in the desert and serves no purpose, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know that. Then related probably to the first one, I was thinking that I'm actually quite unhappy that your study works so well, despite the fact that it is based on the cost-share theorem, that it assumes the cost-share theorem. And I was wondering to what extent you think that your study supports the validity of the cost-share theorem. The other question, recently we've been reading a paper on the financialization of the measure of GDP, which could be expected to decorrelate the measure of real GDP from the real physics that's behind it. And so I was wondering how you were measuring physically in terms of useful energy, financial services, just in more details. And finally, so you showed the data that total factor productivity, once everything's handled appropriately, you see that it has stopped growing since the 70s, 80s. What's just the symmetric is that the price has stopped decreasing of useful Exergy. And I just wonder what was the explanation that you put behind this. Do you link it with resource scarcity or with the impossibility to improve conversion efficiencies, or what's your ideas on that? And I'm good.
Okay. Thank you, Grégoire. You said you were going to say all the questions so that I would choose which ones I would answer. So I I'll be a non-economist, say I don't believe in budget constraints, so I don't manage scarce resources, and I will answer all the questions. So Clémence, you have to put some stop to this, because when I'm answering for too long, then you tell me to stop. Okay, so your first point about the light in the desert, Grégoire. So notice something. Naturally, everything that I've shown to you today is approximate fits. You always see fluctuations. And so the point is, what I would answer to that is that, yes, you're right. Our methodology is incapable of distinguishing between a lamp, which is in my office and I'm using to work, and, for example, the lamp that I left switched on when I left the office and it's no longer being used for anything. My take on this would be, it is economically reasonable that on average, I mean, light in the office is not very important, but on average, people will switch off the light when they leave the office. So, in fact, what these good relations, what then show is that there are very few cases, significant cases of lights in the desert without anyone using them. And a very significant rejoinder to this is that most of the useful exergy that you see here, well, not most, but a very, very sizable part of it, more than half, even today, in our supposedly services economy, more than half of the useful exergy is in industry. Because useful industry uses the most efficient ways of delivering useful exergy. It uses electrical motors that are 90% efficient, and it uses high temperature heat, which is also 80–90%. And so this is part of the point, is that these numbers are dominated by energy use in industry, where it is expensive, and so where it is rationally used, and so where, again, you will not have just, the furnaces burning without them being used for anything.
So still to understand a bit better, I was thinking that, but your measure could capture household work, for instance, what real GDP doesn't measure. But you don't see any difference because it's quite small compared to what the industry delivers.
That doesn't really make a difference. The point is, what we measure muscle work. So it's a biological measure of the mechanical work we do with our arms. This was important 100 years ago. Nowadays, it's irrelevant in our measures. So it doesn't introduce a significant source of error. Okay.
Okay.
About your point about the cost share theorem, I can just hint about this because, in fact, to explain this, I'd need more time, and I'd need to be writing on a whiteboard, on the whiteboard you have there behind that. But Gael, maybe I'll get the chance to do that in May, to write it there in the whiteboard. But something which doesn't appear a lot in the discussions of the cost share theorem, but it does appear, and some of you guys are familiar with that, with the whole critique by Philippe and McCombie and those guys, the whole critique of the aggregate production function, the cost share theorem, and all of that. They were, in fact, careful of noticing something that is in the growth accounting methods, but that people frequently don't notice, which is there are two ways of doing growth accounting. Let's say the primal and the dual. What I've shown you here is the primal one, where you do need to assume the cost share. But you can also do growth accounting without assuming cost share at all. But instead of having two free things, which is the payments to capital and the payments to labor, you have to look at, you think about that the contribution to increased GDP comes from increased capital, increased labor, increased wages, and increased interest rates. So you have four things instead of two. What the neoclassical assumption embedded in the cost share theorem does is that allows you to reduce those four to two things. If you don't use the cost share theorem, you have to do the accounting with four. But now the usual Caldor facts that apply in practice in terms of what's happening with the variables is that what you observe, roughly speaking, is that a long time the returns to capital are roughly constant, so they don't lead to anything. And the changes in labor are very small compared to the changes in GDP and the changes in capital. So of the four things that would contribute to GDP, you are left with only two, which is capital and wages. And capital is already here. And so this is, in fact, should be, everyone who talks about growth accounting should say what I'm going to say. In fact, what we're capturing in total factor productivity is, in fact, almost, not exactly, but it's almost exactly the increase in wages, okay? Or let's say when I correct labor for skills, then my remaining total factor productivity is capturing the unexplained increase in wages, which cannot be explained by the fact that people have a higher education. Because one thing, for example, this is always very interesting to do with students, because it goes against to everyone's intuition, which is the way our societies our economies are organized, and the neoclassical economists would say, because of marginal payments to factors being equal to marginal productivity. That's how a neoclassical economist will explain. Heterodox economists will explain through labor relations, legislation, institutions, etc. So the mechanisms can be completely distinct. But in the end, whatever the mechanisms, which are probably a mix of all of them, the orthodox and the heterodox, all the mechanisms are leading to this fact, which is returns to capital are constant, but wages are increasing. And so, in fact, the end result of our economies, of course, with changes a long time, but roughly the big long-term secular trend is that all of innovation ends up in higher salaries. And the TFP is, in fact, essentially equivalent to the unexplained growth in salaries. So you don't have to be unhappy, Grégoire. I mean, you can be unhappy. I told the story, but later I can tell you the story in a way that won't leave you unhappy, because it can be told without using the cost share theorem. Financialization. I think it's important. There's an issue here, which is financialization doesn't affect all economies equally. And so, for example, it affects a lot the UK economy, which is what would appear here in the spaghetti. So I think I haven't checked this, but I think your intuition is right. The absurd way, the problem, by the way, is, I mean, one thing is real facts about financialization of economies. That's one discussion. But a distinct discussion is the absurd way in which the financial sector is considered to go into GDP, because it's completely absurd. All sectors should be treated in terms of value added, so in terms of payments to capital and payments to labor. And the finance sector gets those odd things with risk and etc. and all those corrections that can make it in times of crisis increase its contribution and all of that. And so, yes, I would expect that would have some effect. But I would just be clear, the problem is not the substantive financialization of the economy. The problem is the inadequate way in which the finance sector is considered in the national accounts towards the calculation of GDP. They are related issues, but they are not the same issues. Let me clarify what I mean by this. The substantive financialization of the economy translates into the fact that the City of London, pre-Brexit, poor guys, now things are not going so well, but pre-Brexit, was an extremely attractive employer paying extremely high salaries. That's real life financialization of the economy. You're drawing talent from other places in the economy into the finance sector and paying them high salaries. But that's something independent of other things that are done when calculating GDP. Okay, and I'll leave the last question for some other occasion, maybe also to give time for other people that may have questions.
So are there any other questions from other people? Yeah.
Yes, someone has other question? Yeah, thank you, Tiago. It's a fantastic presentation. So actually, one of my questions was exactly Grégoire's last question. So you cannot escape it. You have to explain to us why efficiency stagnated starting in the 70s, because we're all wondering what happened in the 70s. That's my first question. The second question is, going back to the building and housing bubble. I understand that, of course, you are trading with real GDP, but there is a housing bubble in the sense that you have a deformation of the structure of prices, and suddenly you may have a 2% inflation and the same building costs like 200% more. So, and this has an impact on the GDP. So in the very same way, I believe financialization, because it's badly treated in GDP, has an impact on GDP, which might lead to some decorrelation with useful exergy. I suspect that we may also observe some decorrelation between GDPs where you have a big housing bubble and useful exergy, because at the end of the day, the building is delivering exactly the same kind of services, even though its cost has been multiplied by X. I had another question, which is exactly on this graph. How would you explain the national differences between intensities? So why, at the end of the day, why are Germans more efficient or less than, I don't know, French? It's an old question.
Portuguese,
et cetera, et cetera. So how would you explain that? And yeah, and that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. In the first place, I have to lodge a complaint because Grégoire said I could get to choose the questions I answered, and then in the end, I don't get.
Yeah,
But that's nice anyway, because that is one question I wanted to go back to. So let me go over here to the graphs. Let me. Well, in fact, I can do it right away here. Right, Grégoire, Gaël, this is basic. This is your question, which is what is happening from 97? What's causing this stagnation, right? That was your question. Okay, there are two issues here, and which, let me tell you, lead to some a very subtle. Well, you may agree or disagree that it's subtle, but a very important issue of causality that's quite interesting, in the difference between how, say, a neoclassical economist or an ecological economist might look at this, and where I think the two perspectives have to be taken into account. Now, let me tell you this story in a technology history mode, and just for graphical purposes, I again show you the cover of Robert Gordon's book, because I think that's a very well told story. What Robert Gordon identifies, but he doesn't really have the tools to explain, is that basically in terms of technological history, there's a burst of economic growth, and especially total factor productivity growth, with the second industrial revolution, with the introduction of the internal combustion engine and the electrical motor. I don't know if any of you guys has read Robert Gordon's book, which is a thick book full of details about technology evolution. But there's a moment there in the middle where, after saying a lot of things, he says, well, now I'm going to try to explain this. And the most he can do, which is already very good for an economic historian, what he tries to nail as being the cause of increasing total factor, the number he tries to get at is, he goes to statistics of number of electrical motors in the US and their horsepower. He's just coming from economics, so he doesn't have a way of putting this in a broader framework. But what he's basically understanding is that is something that, in fact, Henry Ford very, very acutely formulated. Henry Ford said very clearly that the reason he was capable of developing mass production was because of the electrical motor. And the reason is that the electrical motor is extremely efficient, and that efficiency allows you to make small machines. A first industrial revolution factory has a large steam engine. It's extremely inflexible and extremely dangerous. A Henry Ford factory, every worker has his own electrical device. It might be an engine, it might be a soldering machine, it might be an electrical screwdriver. And so it is this introduction of mostly the electrical motor, but also the internal combustion engine, that leads, it's new machines that allow you to do things in a more productive way, because you're capable of controlling more useful exergy. And then this innovation, in a sense, this is a part of Robert Gordon's story, the second industrial revolution innovation runs out. By the 1970s in the US, and also you see here in Portugal, you've essentially introduced the electrical motor in the places where you can do it, and you've run out of new things to do. One of the things I think interesting in this story is that an original criticism of Robert Solow's approach is that it was exogenous growth theory. So total factor productivity was a kind of manna from heaven. And then they went into endogenous growth theory, which hasn't been really empirically, in fact, its success has been very, very, very small. The interesting thing here is that with the story I've been telling you, increased total factor productivity, we're able to pin it down, which is what Solow or exogenous growth theory were incapable of doing. We know where it's happening, but in a sense, it's exogenous in the sense that you can only discover electricity once, or you can only discover the electrical motor once. So it's kind of, in a sense, it is a kind of manna from heaven, which was the usual criticism done of exogenous growth theory and total factor productivity. It's not, obviously, it's not manna from heaven. You have engineers, you have Edison, you have Ford, you have all these guys. But in a sense, it's like they will have that chance. Once you grabbed it, it's gone. And so then this stagnates. Why was I telling about causality? I think there's an important causality issue here that still needs to be teased out, because something that's very messed up in the descriptions of many things are messed up in the descriptions of total factor productivity. But one of them is that it doesn't matter what is the most efficient electrical motor that someone has invented. What matters is the effective number of the real electrical motors which exist in an economy. And so when an economy is growing, business people invest more, they buy more machines, and they obviously buy state-of-the-art machines. So the causality loop runs in the two directions. More efficient machines lead to economic growth, but with economic growth, you invest more, and by investing more, you buy the latest, more efficient machines. If engineers are inventing very efficient machines, but no one is buying them, this efficiency is also not going up. One of the elements of my story that today didn't fit in is that this is about the past. This is about, in the past, the source of economic growth was finding machines that replaced the mechanical work of our arms and of horses and so on. That's basically what machines were doing in the past. ICT technology and now artificial intelligence are let me put this in between quotes, but they are partially replacing our information processing capabilities. And our information processing capabilities are not they're subject to energy limitations, but which are much, much less stringent as in a tractor or a boiler or an air conditioner. So the point is, we can envisage that total factor productivity could go up again in the future, associated to artificial intelligence and machine learning. An interesting thing, I sometimes have this in the end of my presentations, is that you guys may have come across it. These very successful artificial intelligence algorithms, you've probably now heard of ChatGPT, for example. These models take months to be trained, and the computation power required to train these models has been increasing much, much faster than exponentially. And in fact, they are quite dumb, as if you've been using ChatGPT, you've also found that. So the problem is they're not being very efficient. But the difference is that for engines, we have very stringent thermodynamic limits, and we know we're close to that. We can't make electrical motors which are more efficient than we have now. Whilst for computers, this computer, our brain, is several orders of magnitude more efficient than our computers, the machines. And so we know that in principle, we can make things much more efficient. And so we could have increases in total factor productivity in the future associated to ICT, which do not entail increased energy use, if those computer scientists, those computer science guys manage to get their act together instead of having these massively inefficient ways of training the algorithms. Now, trying to go fast into the other two questions, Gael, with the buildings, I think the point is, of course, we would need to check exactly the numbers, but when you mentioned that buildings are becoming much more expensive, you should remember that most of that money is going into land. It's not going into the building. What you are paying for is land, and that's not associated to the service that the building is providing. and the price indices that are being used when you go from nominal to real GDP, I would expect, but I've never checked this carefully, that they correct for that, because in that sense, these national accounting guys, these statisticians, they're the most empirically minded people of the whole economics profession. I mean, comparing with physics, I could still say that they're not as sufficiently empirically minded, but certainly much more empirically minded than theoreticians. And so they're quite square in that. They will tend to say, if I build today a 100 square meter apartment, it has the same real value as a 100 square meter apartment 10 years ago. And so I still think that most of the speculative is removed. Your final question, Gail, is an open research question. It's completely open. In fact, I was discussing this the other day with a student to see if I could persuade him to grab the issue. We don't have right now an explanation for these differences. So the lines are constant roughly constant for each country, but we don't have an explanation for the vertical difference between countries. Theoretically, however, I think this has to be addressed because of the problem, which you all guys all know very well, but I think hasn't been adequately theoretically addressed, of comparing GDP between countries. You cannot do it at exchange rates. I also think the usual way of avoiding that, which is using purchasing power parities, I think that is also wrong, because purchasing power parities in the first place are seen from the side of the consumer. And what we need is something which is analogous between country to the GDP deflator. Point number one. And point number two, I think, in fact, these sole purchasing power parity corrections are not really taking into account adequately the tradable versus non-tradable components of economies. And so, Gael, this is a puzzle, but I'm not sure if the puzzle is real. It might be real, and then that's a research from the energy side, but it might not be real because it might be a problem of inter-country comparisons of GDP.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are pretty much running out of time. So except if there is one last very important question, I think we might have to stop here. Thank you again for attending. Thank you again, Professor, for presenting today. And our next session will be on February the 2nd, I think, with Professor Carrie King. So now I will stop the recording, and maybe Gail, if you want to speak with Tiago.
Thank you, Tiago.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Useful talk.
Useful talk on useful exergy.
Exactly.